you very much. Very theatrical. I can't resist saying that 2 days ago on Saturday I was at an event at the University of Chicago in which the Indian government, through their Ministry of Culture and with great ceremony, initiated a visiting professorship chair named after Swami Vivekananda. And there was some recounting of Swami Vivekananda's visit to the United States in 1893 at the World Congress of Religions. And he won over everybody because on the first day when he got up to speak, not only did he appear in saffron robes and not only was he gorgeous, but he started his speech by saying, "Sisters and brothers of America," not ladies and gentlemen. And that started a kind of movement, a feminist movement around Hinduism and Vivekananda, which got an enormous amount of attention. So sisters and brothers, I'm very happy to be here today. This is my first trip here to Purdue. I've spent the day meeting with students over lunch and over dinner. It's been totally exhilarating. We've had marvelous conversations, and I look forward both to your comments at the end of this lecture and to meetings I'm going to be having tomorrow. This evening, I'm going to examine the famous and, in the grand temporal scheme of things, relatively recent prosecution of a cultural minority group that migrated to the United States over 200 years ago, and whose members fundamentally reject the beliefs, values, and way of life of most contemporary Americans. In 1972, the United States Supreme Court reviewed a legal case known as Wisconsin v. Yoder, in which Amish parents who were members of the Old Order Amish religion and the conservative Amish Mennonite Church were indicted for violating the state of Wisconsin's compulsory school attendance law. The law required that all children in Wisconsin go to school until age 16. 3 Amish parents were prosecuted for failing to send their sons and daughters to school beyond the 8th grade and for keeping them on the farm. By staying on the farm, the boys learned the skills associated with occupational life in a rural Amish community, and quite crucially, they learned to value manual work and physical labor, and perhaps Bible reading, over other types of human pursuits. The girls learned the skills associated with domesticity and the responsibilities of motherhood and family life. The girls were not encouraged to become doctors, lawyers, or MBAs. The boys were not encouraged to become ballet dancers or to run hedge funds. Okay. Both the boys and the girls were prepared for a voluntary late adolescent baptism, a kind of religious and cultural commitment ceremony, and were more fully initiated into the beliefs, virtues, and values of the Amish way of life. I'm going to examine this case and the reasoning of the court, the prosecution, and the defense in some detail. Okay. Before I do that, I want to just have a small biographical, parenthetical comment, make one, and also give you some theoretical background, and then I'm going to launch into the case itself and maybe discuss one other case as well. The biographical note is basically the following. I grew up in the New York metropolitan area, and I was a very young person when television first arrived in the United States. And I have a vivid memory of a public service advertisement that appeared on television in those early days of television, at least in the New York metropolitan area. I sort of dimly recall it was sponsored by Levy's Rye Bread, but in any case, it was a kind of cartoon-like advertisement with a jingle, and the jingle went as follows. George Washington loved good roast beef. Haim Solomon loved fish. When Uncle Sam served liberty, they both enjoyed the dish. And who's Haim Solomon, you might be asking. And in the background were cartoon figures of George Washington and a big roast beef and all other kinds of things that went with this jingle. Haim Solomon was a Jewish friend of George Washington who was a banker and financier and helped bankroll the American Revolution. That it was a Jewish character is interesting at that time, and the kind of liberty that was being promoted is something that's been on my mind, I suspect, throughout my life. That's the biographical note, and I have at various times in my life tried to run that jingle through substituting other kinds of things for it. In the context of American society, choosing between roast beef and fish is probably not a huge deal, although you can certainly go to places in the world, and certainly in India where I work, the choice between roast beef and fish or roast beef and vegetables would in fact be a rather significant and identity-defining and status-defining issue. But I've played it through with, George Washington loved polygamy. Haim Solomon loved monogamy. When Uncle Sam served liberty, they both enjoyed their kinship systems. And you can run it through with all sorts of things. And the issue that's been on my mind and defines at least one part of the projects I've been investigating over the years is exactly what is the scope and what is the limit of toleration for cultural differences. How much liberty is there going to be, and what would justify restraints on liberty or external interference with cultural practices? I sometimes call this customs control. And when you come across borders into other territories, there are all sorts of processes interested in controlling your customs, or not, and that's the issue. So coming to terms with diversity in an increasingly multicultural world has, as you may have noticed, become one of the most pressing public policy projects for liberal democracies in the early 21st century. One way to come to terms with diversity is to try to understand the scope and limits of toleration for variety at different national sites where immigration from foreign lands has complicated the cultural landscape. My talk today examines a series of legal and moral questions about the proper response to norm conflict between mainstream populations and cultural minority groups, including old and new immigrants, with special reference to disputed cases that have arisen in the recent history of the United States. The cultural anthropologist Clifford Gertz, many of you probably know of his work, some of you may not. He was the founder of the School of Social Science at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, and arguably the most famous American cultural anthropologist in the last half of the 20th century. In any case, he remarked as follows, quote, "Positioning Muslims in France, whites in South Africa, Arabs in Israel, or Koreans in Japan are not altogether the same sort of thing. But if political theory is going to be of any relevance at all in the splintered world, it will have to have something cogent to say about how, in the face of a drive towards a destructive integrity, such structures can be brought into being, how they can be sustained, and how they can be made to work," end quote. By the phrase, the splintered world, Clifford Gertz means our contemporary world of borderless capitalism, in which globalization has become a motivating, albeit controversial, ideal. In that world, not only goods, including cultural goods and symbols, and financial capital are encouraged to travel more and more freely across national frontiers, but labor too moves internationally, although with highly variable and somewhat fewer degrees of freedom. And of course, we're not talking here just of Muslims in France or Koreans in Japan. Let's turn to Israel. What's one of the largest labor forces in Israel these days? Thais in Israel, Bangladeshis in Saudi Arabia, Angolans in South Africa, Nicaraguans in Costa Rica, Guatemalans in Mexico, Mexicans in the United States, Gambians in Norway, and so forth. Indeed, in our splintered world at the end of the 20th century, well over 125 million people, including at least 27 million political refugees, lived outside their country of birth or citizenship, which many people think is an all-time high. About 1/3 of that international migration moved in the direction of the 7 wealthiest countries in the world, which includes the United States and Canada. Interestingly, about 50% moved across national borders within the Third World. And if you think that people vote with their feet to be Americans or something, there's an enormous amount of migration that is not into the wealthiest countries of the world. In fact, most of the migration in the world doesn't move in that direction, although a lot does move into the 7 wealthiest countries. As a footnote, it should be mentioned that although 125 million or so may be an all-time high in terms of numbers of people living abroad, the deep and long-term significance of that number is not entirely transparent. Indeed, it may even be a useful corrective to some of the grandiosity, utopianism, and presentism of the current discourse about globalization, cosmopolitanism, and the free flow of everything, to remember that internationalism is neither a new thing nor is it an irreversible process. The last great push to globalize the world and promote free trade and labor migration in the late 19th century, and if you look between 1870 and 1914, you will see very much the same thing happening as is happening in the last 40 years, let's say, in the world, the last 40 years in the world. In any case, that last great push came to a crashing halt with World War I. It was followed by a good deal of protectionism, isolationism, and nationalist fervor. It remains to be seen, I think, whether we're witnessing something new in the organization of a world system or whether we're just compulsively repeating a deep historical cycle, another swing in the internationalism, nationalism, free trade, restrictive tariff, open borders, closed borders pendulum. Deja vu all over again. Okay. And even now in these heady, high-tech online days of so-called borderless capitalism and expanding global markets, it may be wise to remain a little bit cautious in the face of visionary claims about a new transnational neoliberal world order. It still remains a fact that approximately 98% of the people on the planet Earth have more or less stayed put, in the sense that they live in the country where they were born and where they are citizens. Indeed, many of them have not only stayed put, but also believe there are too many splinters around, namely foreigners. Hence, Clifford Gertz's mention of a drive towards a destructive integrity. At least some of the 2% who are on the move are making at least some of the 98% who feel settled in their national geography and want to feel at home in their own culture also feel rather nervous about the future of their own way of life. And I might add vice versa, because some of those who migrate across national borders, some of those who are in the 2%, may well be told when they arrive in some foreign land to either conform to local cultural norms or else go away. Okay. Now, a drive towards a destructive integrity is an arresting, even if tendentious, expression. I take Clifford Gertz to use that phrase to refer to the inclination of dominant cultural groups to demand and or require of culturally different immigrant minority groups that they alter their way of life and assimilate their tastes, values, and practices to mainstream cultural norms, including the inclination to make use of the coercive power of the state to cleanse the local national scene of genuine cultural diversity. In other words, I take his notion of a drive towards destructive integrity to basically point to a very broad notion of ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing doesn't have to be thought of only in its murderous genocidal form. There are all sorts of ways in which ethnic cleansing goes on as a process. It goes on by restricting immigration in the first place. It goes on by deporting people. It goes on by redrawing boundaries around cultural groups or enclaves. It goes on by having intense top-down centralized processes which one way or another get people to abandon their practices and to assimilate or be included in mainstream norms. Okay? And it's a powerful process, and I think it's a great mistake to simply associate the ethnic cleansing notion with murderous genocide, in part because, whether you like it or not, there are certain kinds of outcomes of ethnic cleansing which are documentable. One of them is, if you're really interested in promoting equality like income equality in a territory, one of the best ways to do it is to make yourself ethnically homogeneous. And you will discover, as I have recently discovered in an empirical project I'm involved in with several others, that the countries in the world that are the most egalitarian with regard to income distribution are those that are the most ethnically homogeneous. Slovenia is a lot better than India. Okay. Croatia today, after all the kinds of ethnic cleansing that go on, is a lot more egalitarian than the United States. India and the United States are highly diverse multicultural societies. In any case, you will discover that if you really want to get relative egalitarian distributions, it's almost a necessary condition to ethnically cleanse. You can start speculating about why that might be, about why social welfare and redistributive efforts are more effectively done when everyone feels like they're of the same group, kind, with the same ancestry, religion, language, and so forth. But in any case, there is a reality. It also has been argued provocatively by the historian Jerry Mueller that one of the reasons for relative peace in Europe since World War II between nations is because actually the ethno-national project succeeded. And Europe managed to redraw boundaries, go through periods of massive conflict between groups, deport, and do other kinds of things that ultimately realign boundaries so that you have a Europe even now, in the year 2000, let's say, that is far more ethnically homogeneous within any political entity than it was 100 years earlier. So there are these processes that have to be paid attention to. For example, in a number of countries in the predominantly Christian regions of Northern Europe today, Islam is perceived as a real or potential danger. And in those countries, you will find even center-left political leaders voicing attitudes that evoke images of strident cultural nationalism. You find leaders who basically say, in Denmark, we work in the workplace, we don't pray in the workplace. And they get very upset when people want the possibility of having prayer at their work sites. And I only have to remind you, I think, of just a few well-known, well, maybe not all of them are well-known events that have happened. We could start with the referendum in Switzerland, which prohibits the building of minarets in Switzerland. More recently, I have received email communications from a current student and a former student, both of whom thought I might be interested in a news report about Norwegian social service agencies, an extension of the government, removing 2 young children from an South Asian Indian family in Norway because they were observed to be co-sleeping with their children, 3 years old and 1 year old, and hand-feeding the children, hand-to-mouth feeding, which are routine practices, at least in the parts of India I work in, both co-sleeping and hand-to-mouth feeding of children. The kids were taken away from their parents because this was thought to be abusive, presumably to create dependency or not let them be independent, self-reliant children or whatever. But the details I have to research. But in any case, there is a report published in an Indian newspaper about this happening. If you look at Sweden, I have a grandson, and I was present when the grandson was circumcised in Washington, D.C. by a mohel on the 8th day after his birth. I held the throne of Elijah, as it's called, the pillow, after the circumcision took place. That's illegal in Sweden today. You cannot have a Jewish bris in Sweden. And regulations have come down which essentially require, if you're going to have a circumcision at all, it must be done in a hospital, it must be done with a surgeon present, and anesthesia must be used. Okay. In Denmark, there's been a recent report in which the Dutch Medical Association has condemned non-medical male circumcision and called on Muslims and Jews to give it up. We could go on and on. Kosher slaughter. Again, if you went to Sweden, you could not find any meat that went through a process of kosher slaughter, also prohibited. So there are all sorts of ways in which ethno-national sentiments in countries that are ethnically homogeneous view the state as basically an instrument for carrying forward their way of life end up reacting to minority groups. Okay, so the idea conform to mainstream cultural beliefs and practices about work and family or stay away is of course not just a European attitude. You can find attitudes of this type in the United States as well, although I would argue not as intensely for good reasons. In any case, here's a quote: "Cultural differences are beautiful," comments Marceline Walter, who directs community education in the New York State Administration for Children's Services, "but they have nothing to do with the law. We can't possibly have a set of laws for Americans, a set of laws for immigrants, and a set of laws for tourists." She comments this way after a Danish couple, ironically, is arrested because they're in a restaurant in New York sitting inside a window, and they've left their young child in a stroller just outside the window where they can see it, a custom they claim is very common in Denmark, but Children's Services in New York thought this was irresponsible behavior on the part of the parents, and they're arrested for child neglect. Okay. On the other hand, the strong assimilationist stance, this drive towards a destructive integrity of the sort expressed in those comments, is not the only possible response to immigrants from foreign lands who bring with them unfamiliar or even alien beliefs and practices. National attitudes towards cultural differences tend to be contingent on current social, economic, and political circumstances, on the history of a nation's engagement with minority groups, and on the legal and ethical normative regime in place in particular nations, which is one of the reasons that I want to look at legal cases. Nevertheless, a more facilitative live and let live pluralistic or accommodative impulse of the sort expressed, for example, by Supreme Court Justice William Brennan has also been voiced in some liberal democracies. Justice Brennan remarks as follows in one of his decisions, quote, "We are not an assimilative, homogeneous society, but a facilitative, pluralistic one in which we must be willing to abide someone else's unfamiliar or even repellent practice because the same tolerant impulse protects our own idiosyncrasies." Okay. And of course, it's here that I'm reminded of that public service jingle that I mentioned to you earlier about George Washington and Haym Salomon. It also seems noteworthy that as we enter the 21st century, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, the INS, of our own country, publishes a document called "What are the Benefits and Responsibilities of Citizenship?" which states the following, quote, "America becomes stronger when all its citizens respect the different opinions, cultures, ethnic groups, and religions found in this country. Tolerance for differences is also a responsibility of citizenship." So in this talk, I'm going to try to partly address, by examining one particular legal case and the reasoning that emerged in it, Clifford Gertz's and Mr. Justice William Brennan's pluralistic challenge. And I suppose the big question that's been on my mind, I'm in the process of writing a book trying to address this question, is it possible to be a robust cultural pluralist? I view myself as a robust cultural pluralist in the spirit of that jingle, and a dedicated political liberal at the same time, or not. And I don't think the answer is obvious. Okay, so there are versions of liberalism which are not particularly tolerant to illiberal practices, and other versions which are prepared to accommodate or at least accept a live and let live attitude and not require that everyone privilege liberalism over all other values. Okay. In any case, the Amish, as you probably know, are Mennonites who can trace their spiritual lineage back to the Swiss, German, and Dutch Anabaptists of the 16th century, an heterodox, much persecuted Christian sect. As described by the Supreme Court, the Anabaptists, quote, "rejected institutionalized churches and sought to return to the early, simple Christian life, de-emphasizing material success, rejecting the competitive spirit, and seeking, even back then, to insulate themselves from the modern world." It was an essential feature, and essentially they were trying to reproduce life at the apostolic times. It was an essential feature of the Amish defense that they were dedicated to a long-standing tradition or way of life that was itself a way of making manifest and expressing certain strict, sincerely held religious beliefs that they had maintained more or less constant for centuries. And they claimed their way of life would be threatened if they exposed their kids to the values, practices, and social environment and curriculum of a modern Wisconsin high school. The First Amendment of our Constitution, as you may know, bars the government from either establishing religion, that is, favoring one religion over another, creating a state religion, providing sponsorship or financial support to religion, or from interfering with the so-called free exercise of religion. I must say that I recently asked students in a graduate seminar of mine to tell me the first 10 amendments to the American Constitution. It wasn't a happy moment. So I hope you're all sitting here seeing whether you could say to yourself, what are the first 10 amendments of the Constitution? And if you get past 2 or 3, you've done better than my graduate students did at the University of Chicago. And they certainly could not have told me all aspects of the First Amendment. Okay? But in any case, the non-establishment and the free exercise clause with regard to religion are part of the First Amendment jurisprudence. At this moment in the evolution of our legal tradition, there are 2 hotly contested interpretations of the true meaning of the free exercise of religion clause. Just these simple words about the free exercise of religion end up being provocative and invite different interpretations. According to one interpretation, which I shall dub the authority of religious conscience interpretation, the injunction that Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion has the following meaning, namely, that in the absence of a sufficiently compelling secular public need, for example, public safety, the government should grant exemptions, for example, to the Amish, from general legal obligations that conflict with religious duties, assuming that those religious duties are matters of conscience that can be traced to sincerely held religious beliefs. According to the second interpretation, which I shall dub the non-discrimination interpretation, the injunction has the following meaning: that all citizens are entitled to equal but not unlimited liberty, such that no law shall be written that deliberately discriminates against them or displays hostility towards them because of their sincerely held religious beliefs and related practices. According to that second view, the Free Exercise Clause expresses a principle of non-discrimination and little more. It should not be interpreted as a statement of privilege, a claim for exemption from general legal obligations, for practices related to sincerely held religious beliefs or perceived obligations to God. According to that non-discrimination interpretation, a law that happens to have a negative effect on the practices of a particular religious group does not necessarily violate constitutional guarantees of religious freedom. By that reading of the Free Exercise Clause, a law, for example, one prohibiting all forms of animal slaughter, perhaps on grounds of cruelty to animals, would not necessarily be a violation of religious liberty, even if in effect it criminalized the ritual sacrifice of animals in religious ceremonies. It would not run afoul of the Free Exercise Clause as long as the law is formally neutral, displays on its face no particular hostility to religion or to particular religious groups, and is generally applied to all citizens, hunters, pest control experts, slaughterhouses, members of religious groups, all of them generally having to abide by the law without discrimination. Similarly, a ban on all alcohol consumption, let's say during Prohibition, would not run afoul of free exercise under this interpretation of the Free Exercise Clause if it prohibited the use of sacramental wine if the effect of the law was to criminalize the sacramental wine during communion, as long as it wasn't a law written to go after Catholics, okay, but was generally applied on other grounds. Okay. Whatever one's interpretation of the true meaning of the Free Exercise Clause, any challenge to the constitutionality of a law or statute in the name of free exercise of religion must begin with the identification of the sincerely held religious beliefs associated with some group, community, or so-called church. It is in relationship to those sincerely held religious beliefs that conscientious assertions of religious duties of various sorts, obligations to God in contrast to obligations to the state, can then be derived and assessed, and questions concerning the interests of the state, the degree of facial neutrality of the law, and so forth, can be evaluated. In the case of the Amish, the relevant sincerely held religious belief was their literal interpretation of one particular biblical injunction from the Epistle of Paul to the Romans, which in the context of concerns about immigration reads to me like a rather fundamental and perfect anti-assimilation principle, because the injunction basically says, be not conformed to the world. That's the biblical injunction. This was held by the Amish parents, by expert witnesses, some of them anthropologists, and ultimately by the court to be central to the Amish faith, and was identified as a pervasive religious principle regulating the entire Amish way of life. Any anthropological or historical summary of the Amish is likely to make note of certain distinctive features of their cultural community, including a religiously motivated pacifism. That's what distinguishes them from the Taliban, because in many ways they share features that the Taliban also share, like sex role differentiation, not wanting to send your kids to school. They really don't think MTV is beauty parlors, and they are appealing, and the men have beards that are attempting to look like the apostles of Christ, or at least apostolic times, and so forth. In any case, religiously motivated pacifism, a rejection of the idea of oaths, the conduct of religious services at home rather than in churches, and often in the German language. Of course, there's the rejection of baptism, early baptism as it's generally practiced, on the grounds that how could a child have any comprehension of sin at the time they're baptized? That's why they want it to be a late adolescent baptism, when there can be an understanding of the meaning of sin and a commitment. That's a commitment taken by someone who's in a position to do so. And thus, they reject many of the beliefs, values, virtues, and material objects like telephones, radios, cars, televisions that we associate with life in the modern world, and they strictly limit their contact with the non-Amish world. And as parents, they wish to perpetuate their way of life by passing on their own way of seeing and being in the world to their children. Okay. In that regard, they strongly discourage certain kinds of exposure to the outside world and disapprove of marriage outside the faith. They have an interest in preserving their religious and cultural tradition, which turns in large part on their ability to recruit adherents to the next generation. And any cultural tradition that has a deep commitment to letting the ancestors have a vote, carrying forward a received tradition, is going to want to have some degree of control over the two things that really matter if you're going to carry on a way of life: education and marriage. Okay. The state of Wisconsin thought the Amish should have to send their kids to school beyond the 8th grade, just like everyone else. Okay. And the state thought that just like everyone else, Amish parents should not be permitted to shield their children from what the state viewed as useful knowledge, and should not be allowed to keep their children ignorant. Okay. They use that term, keep them ignorant. Okay. And there was some notion of there being a state-mandated curriculum that everyone in the state should be exposed to so they could gain useful knowledge. If you pursue this route of looking at legal cases, very quickly you're going to come upon some rather fascinating cases in the history of the United States Supreme Court. For example, just to mention two, Meyer v. Nebraska, a decision of the early 1920s, in which the state of Nebraska passed a statute that prohibited the teaching of all modern foreign languages to any child in the state of Nebraska under 12 years of age. on the grounds that, and of course this was just after World War I. There was enormous hostility towards Germany and German. There was a kind of Whorfian hypothesis that language and thought go together, and brains develop early. So the first 12 years were seen as crucial for getting their brains, and English was the language of democracy and German the language of autocracy and tyranny. They were smart enough to realize they couldn't write a statute only targeting German, so they eliminated teaching of all modern foreign languages in the state of Nebraska. And a parochial school teacher was prosecuted for teaching German to a 9-year-old. They made exceptions for 3 languages, all of which they thought were dead languages: Latin, Greek, and at that time, Hebrew. You could teach those 3, but nothing else, no other language but English. And this went to the Supreme Court. The court overturned it. It's one of those cases that stands out as defending parental rights. But the famous Oliver Wendell Holmes was in dissent and was perfectly prepared to support that law. About the same time, there was a Supreme Court case called Pierce versus Society of Sisters, which came out of Oregon, where a state referendum was held in which it was voted that there could be no private schools in the state of Oregon. Only public school education, only common school education, because in those private schools were all these immigrants, and they were teaching foreign languages. And they wanted to gain control over the curriculum in public schools and assimilate these dangerous minority viewpoints. That also was thrown out. I'll mention it a little more later. In any case, the state of Wisconsin argued that its system of compulsory education was uniformly and generally applied to all families in Wisconsin. They argued the system was not created with any animus towards the Amish per se, and it was argued the educational system served important public needs. Not only preparation for intelligent citizenship and for a productive life in society, but also the provision of the opportunity to benefit from the offerings of a modern secondary school education, regardless of the wishes of one's parents. Justice White, in his decision, put it this way, quote, "In the present case, the state is not concerned with the maintenance of an educational system as an end in itself. It's rather attempting to nurture and develop the human potential of its children, whether Amish or non-Amish, to expand their knowledge, broaden their sensibilities, kindle their imagination, foster a spirit of free inquiry, and increase their human understanding and tolerance. It is possible that most Amish children will wish to continue living the rural life of their parents. Others, however, may wish to become nuclear physicists, ballet dancers, computer programmers, or historians, and for these occupations, formal training will be necessary." Notice here this notion that everything should be open to everyone, a certain kind of vision that I would associate with a certain form of liberal thinking. And notice, too, that if you actually pursue this policy to its logical extreme, you eliminate cultural capital because, of course, cultural groups don't all agree on what is a worthy profession, on what is a noble occupation, on what skills ought to be cultivated. But if everything's going to be open to everyone with equal likelihood, you're essentially involved in a policy that is anti-cultural and certainly anti-family in some deep sense. Okay. Justice William O. Douglas, in his famous partial dissent from the opinion of the court, wondered whether there really is or should be an identity of interest between parents and their children. The required high school education would make it easier to transcend one's family and social background. Okay. He wanted to hear more from the kids, only one of whom, Frida Yoder, had testified about their own degree of commitment to the Amish way of life. Douglas wrote, "The parents are seeking to vindicate not only their own free exercise claims, but also those of their high school age children." He went on and wrote in his dissent, quote, "If the parents in this case are allowed a religious exemption, the inevitable effect is to impose the parents' notion of religious duty upon their children." I think the children should be entitled to be heard. While the parents absent dissent normally speak for the entire family, the education of the child is a matter on which the child will often have decided views. He may want to be a pianist or an astronaut or an oceanographer. To do so, he will have to break with the Amish tradition. It's the future of the student, not the future of the parents, that is imperiled by today's decision. If a parent keeps his child out of school beyond the grade school, then the child will be forever barred from entry into the new and amazing world of diversity that we have today. Okay. Well, it's not very hard, I think, to imagine a contemporary human rights activist extending Justice White and Justice Douglas's "there but for fortune goes you or goes I" line of argument, and expressing a related sense of regret about the loss of certain options available to Frida Yoder, for example, should her Amish parents be allowed to raise her as they see fit. Namely, that Frida Yoder might well have learned, had she gone to a Wisconsin public school in the late 1960s, which is when this would have been, she might well have learned to become a feminist activist, scornful of the sex role differentiation within the Amish community, if only the state had been able to compel her parents to enroll her in a Wisconsin secondary school at that time. Okay. I'm told, by the way, I've recently learned, someone has told me that that Frida Yoder is a midwife serving the Amish community decades later. Okay. But in any case, as you've undoubtedly inferred, the Amish were granted an exemption from the compulsory education laws of Wisconsin by the United States Supreme Court. I think it's interesting to ask, if you put yourself in the role of the prosecutor in Wisconsin, had the court voted against them, apparently the families were prepared to pick up and leave the United States and go to Canada with their children. And if you're the prosecutor, having just won this Supreme Court case, had it turned out that way, what's your next step? Okay. Are you prepared to get some kind of court injunction prohibiting the rights of travel of the parents? Are you prepared to say, you go, but your kids aren't going with you, and remove the kids from the family, as just happened in Norway, and give them to foster care so that they can be exposed to the curriculum in the secondary school and have this amazing world of diversity and occupational possibility opened up to them, or not? Okay. You can see where certain lines of reasoning lead you if you go down that road. In any case, in an opinion written by Justice Berger, but supported by most of the liberal judges on the court in 1972, when this was decided, the court balanced the interests of the state in universal education against the rights of American citizens to religious liberty and to follow the dictates of a religious conscience. The state's interest in education was fully acknowledged by the court. Nevertheless, the required extra years of schooling beyond 8th grade did not seem to be essential to the court, because the Amish learned useful skills at home, were self-sufficient and potentially employable, for example, as carpenters or farmers, for example, although they don't address the issue of the women, should they choose to venture out into the modern world. By 8th grade, they knew how to read and write and count, and there was no evidence that the Amish could not discharge the responsibilities of citizenship. Moreover, their religious beliefs were sincere, and their way of life, which gave substance to their beliefs and made manifestly obvious their sincerity, was a recognizable, long-standing, and the court seemed to suggest even admirable tradition, which was truly threatened by the compulsory education law of Wisconsin. If Amish children are forced to go to school until age 16, the court concluded, quoting them, they must either abandon belief or be assimilated into society at large, or be forced to migrate to some other and more tolerant region. This is how the court put it. They seem to be admirers, as I said, of this Amish tradition. Thus, in 1972, the scale tilted heavily on the side of the Amish, although that decision of that court remains controversial to this day, and my guess is it would be controversial in this audience if we were to take a vote on how you would come out if you were on that court. Notably, the decision granting an exemption to the Amish relied on an authority of religious conscience interpretation of the Free Exercise Clause of the Bill of Rights and expressed some skepticism about the non-discrimination point of view. In the opinion of the court, the Wisconsin school attendance requirement did indeed apply uniformly and generally to all citizens of the state. It did not on its face discriminate against religions or against the Amish. It made no mention of the Amish, was not written with the Amish in mind, and it was motivated by a perfectly legitimate secular concern. These conditions of generality and formal neutrality, limited but equal liberty, and hence apparent non-discrimination were, however, judged to be insufficient for disposing of the case. According to the court, quote, a regulation neutral on its face may, in its application, nonetheless offend the constitutional requirement for government neutrality if it unduly burdens the free exercise of religion. The court called for doctrinal flexibility and a realistic case-by-case based application of the First Amendment religion clauses. The opinion went on to say, quote, the court must not ignore the danger that an exception from a general obligation of citizenship on religious grounds may run afoul of the Establishment Clause, favoring the Amish Mennonites over other religions when they're exempted from the law and others aren't. But that danger cannot be allowed to prevent any exception, no matter how vital it may be, to the protection of values promoted by the right of free exercise. Interestingly, this being the United States, that decision was a huge boost for homeschooling, because very quickly people said, what do you mean the Amish can do this and I can't? And very quickly it was generalized. In any case, I think anthropology has a lot to learn from the careful study of cases such as Wisconsin v. Yoder, and also much to contribute to the development of a normative discourse about difference that emerges out of cases of this type. For example, the court was impressed that the Amish had remained committed to religious beliefs that their forebears had adhered to for 300 years, and to a way of life that remained constant, quote unquote, perhaps some would say static, the court wrote, for a rather long time. In several ways, a conception of culture as a shared and relatively stable conception of the sacred made manifest in everyday practice, not unlike that developed by Emil Durkheim in the elementary forms of the religious life, and also not unlike the conception of culture disparaged by skeptical postmodernists and anti-culturalists in contemporary anthropology, carried the day for the Amish in their fight against the state. Had a skeptical postmodern anthropologist or human activist been called as an expert witness, I've wondered what would they have said? Okay, would they have said that Yoder is merely an individual who has multiple selves and has manufactured or socially constructed a fictive or imagined communal past, which is not really the real past and certainly has not been static and is always changing? Would they have said that the Amish practices are in constant flux and thus don't deserve deference or protection as sacred objects? Would they have said that the less control any parent has over a child's socialization, the better, especially for those antiquated Amish patriarchs? Okay. Is that the kind of testimony one might have expected from an anthropologist in 2011 or 12? Okay. The court reasoned as follows. In evaluating those claims, the alleged violation of their religious freedom by the compulsory education law, we must be careful to determine whether the Amish religious faith and their mode of life are, as they claim, inseparable and interdependent. A way of life, however virtuous and admirable, may not be interposed as a barrier to reasonable state regulation of education if it's based on purely secular considerations. To have the protection of the religion clauses, the claims must be rooted in religious belief. Although a determination of what is a religious belief or practice entitled to constitutional protection may present a most delicate question, the very concept of ordered liberty precludes allowing every person to make his own standards on matters of conduct in which society as a whole has important interests. This raises, of course, the fascinating question whether or not protection of free exercise is somehow deeply connected to a thick notion of cultural tradition. And if you look at many of these kinds of cases, of which there aren't all that many, the ones that tend to prevail tend to be the ones in which there is a rich, thick anthropological story to be told about how religious belief is tied up with a way of life that has some durability and is long-standing. Thus, and they go on to say, thus, if the Amish asserted their claims because of their subjective evaluation and rejection of the contemporary secular values accepted by the majority, much as Thoreau rejected the social values of his time and isolated himself at Walden Pond, their claims would not rest on a religious basis. Thoreau's choice, this is the Supreme Court talking, Thoreau's choice was philosophical and personal rather than religious, and such belief does not rise to the demands of the religion clauses. I don't know about you, but I'm rather impressed by the erudition of the clerks who worked in the Supreme Court in the late 1960s and 1970s who were quoting Thoreau and other kinds of historical sources in decisions of this type. In any case, that comment, distinguishing between religious versus non-religious, sincerely held religious beliefs, bothered Justice Douglas. In his partial dissent, he reminded the court that in other decisions, the court had already expanded the concept of religious belief to include any sincere and meaningful belief that occupied a parallel place in the conscience of its possessor to that filled by the idea of God. And he reminded that he had in mind a Supreme Court decision concerning conscientious objection to military service, namely Pete Seeger, and whether or not he should be granted an exemption on religious grounds. An instructive feature of the opinion of the court, at least for minority groups seeking to position themselves within American society, is that the court seemed to be impressed by the Amish way of life, perhaps even to the point of romanticizing their culture. This was not a court that was in the mood to take a decision that might bring an end to the Amish way of life. It is not just that they were impressed that the Amish had been around a long time or that their religious beliefs were sincere. The court also notes that the, quote, the Amish qualities of reliability, self-reliance, and dedication to work would be readily marketable in today's society. The court remarks that the Greene County Amish of Wisconsin had never been known to commit crimes or receive public assistance, and none were unemployed. Okay. In fact, the court commends Amish communities and asserts that they are, quote, singularly parallel and reflect many of the virtues of Jefferson's idea of the sturdy yeoman who would form the basis of what he, Thomas Jefferson, considered as the ideal of a democratic society. Even their idiosyncratic separateness, this is a quote, the court avers, quote, exemplifies the diversity we profess to admire and encourage. I'm tempted by the following speculation that the Amish might have been assisted in their case by the perception that they were a small, industrious, non-threatening, and virtue-minded minority group. It was almost as if the court valued having Amish in our midst, nostalgically reminding us of an imagined time when the world was less competitive, less hectic, and less modern. Stating their judicial opinion in a way that warms the heart of at least this robust anthropological pluralist, the court wrote as follows, quote, we must not forget that in the Middle Ages, important values of the civilization of the Western world were preserved by members of religious orders who isolated themselves from all worldly influences against great obstacles. There can be no assumption that today's majority is right and the Amish and others like them are wrong. A way of life that is odd or even erratic but interferes with no rights or interests of others is not to be condemned because it is different. This is a rather remarkable statement. Much of First Amendment jurisprudence on this topic talks this way and refuses to engage in the idea that there might be an objective moral charter that some people know better than others. It's either a very subjectivist position or it's a position that says whatever moral charter might be out there, it's not for the state to try and determine what it is and impose it as might be done in a theocracy. Okay. Finally, the court rededicates itself to what it sees as an enduring principle of the constitutional tradition of the United States, namely that it is not the role of the government to save children from either themselves or their parents. For example, by requiring Amish children to get educated in a Wisconsin high school, or increasing the odds that Frida Yoder will grow up to become a cosmopolitan feminist. It's up to parents, not the state, the court argued, to raise children and to guide their religious education, and we should not leave it up to the government to determine the religious future of a child. In the United States, at least, it is presumed that children belong to their parents and not to the state, unlike the way in which other countries do think about it. In France, that's not the view. In Norway and Sweden, I don't think that's the view either. It's more like parents are the appointed guardians of children, appointed by the state, and in some of those countries at least, children have, it's almost the equivalent of having a hotline to the social services agency to press the button, call them in against your parents, should the parents do things that are thought to be abusive, like even spanking a child would be illegal in Norway and Sweden. In any case, just to conclude, because this was a mouthful and I've gone on probably a little too long already, the normative regime that's going to emerge out of current conflicts over the interpretation of that single important clause in the First Amendment to our Constitution is clearly going to be consequential. It's going to make a difference for the scope permitted to unfamiliar and alien cultural practices related to sincerely held and self-defining sacred religious cultural beliefs. It's going to make a difference for the construction, management, and handling of differences in our increasingly multicultural national scene. And I will just end by saying, not only does one have to think through the issues like the free exercise of religion clause and whether or not that is extendable to the free exercise of culture, one also has to think about, as is implied in this case, the relationship of parental rights to children's rights, the relationship of definitions of what's public to what's private, and just take those three dimensions alone. You can see that a polity that is willing to expand have a conception of free exercise of religion that is quite expansive and includes culture, a polity that is weighted towards parental rights over children's rights, and a polity that narrows rather than broadens the realm of the public is going to be a regime that makes more space rather than less space for cultural diversity, I would argue. The more restrictive your notion of free exercise of religion, the more it becomes just a non-discrimination principle, the more expansive your notion of children's rights against parents, and the more the narrowing of the private realm and the expansion of the public realm, the less space there's going to be for cultural diversity within any polity. And my prediction would be that if you look at the more culturally homogeneous ethno-national entities in the world, political entities, you're going to find that the latter combination is operating. The United States, I think, does have a form of exceptionalism. You know, American exceptionalism is something people always talk about, but what particular features are the exceptional features? I do think that we live in a polity that is exceptional in that it is not ethno-national, at least not in the sense that many of the European nation states are ethno-national. That's not to say there aren't plenty of Americans who would like it to be or think of it as a Christian country, but it has been multicultural from the start. And my reading of the founders is that they read very widely, even about ancient empires and trying to think about the design of a society. And they created something in which everyone's a hyphenated American. Citizenship is thinner rather than thicker and is not related to commitment to particular cultural ways of life. With that, I think I'll end and take any questions you have. Thank you very much.